Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to the PSHRE Teachers Network, our third webinar, and the focus is how do we know our PSHRE lessons have impact. And I'm really excited to be joined today by Donna, who is Assistant Principal and PSHRE Leader at Ormiston, South Wolverhampton and Bilston Academy, and Nicole Rodden, co-founder of Life Lessons, who are both going to be contributing to this and actually probably providing the majority of the content today. Claire, if you could move on for me, please. Okay, obviously don't have a photograph for Donna, but I'm Bex. I am the curriculum lead for relationship and sex education and health education at the Bridgewater and Taunton College Trust down in Somerset, and I also teach science 4 days a week as well. Obviously, I've introduced Donna and Nicole, and when we get to the individual bits of presentation, they will, I'm sure, introduce themselves in greater detail. So we're going to look at what the purpose is of assessment, and I'm going to touch sort of lightly on starters, at using starters and plenaries for assessment. And Donna is going to focus on formative assessment and some other just general ideas and tips from her very extensive experience of PSHE. And Nicole is going to look at using pupil voice to monitor the impact of your PSHE lessons. And then we'll have a little quick look at looking at whole school impact. What ways can we measure the impact of our PSHE just by looking at other things around our school? And then we'll take questions at the end. So if you think of a question as we're going along, please pop it in the chat. I think there's a question, there's a Q&A box, and there's also the chat function. And probably best if you pop them in the Q&A questions, and then Chloe will go through those, and then we will do those at the end. So starters and plenaries, I think Donna will touch on this later. I use them an awful lot in my PSHE lessons, and sometimes it can be the only thing that's written in their books is the starter that then they have reviewed at the end of the lesson. There might not be any other work because it's been a very discussion based, or there might have been a debate, or they might have been doing something a bit more creative. And so we use a starter activity that establishes a baseline. It doesn't matter whether these can be adapted for primary, secondary, children with SEND, been used really successfully by a friend of mine who works in a PRU, that because they're sort of easy access and low stakes. So for example, things like just you know, writing a mind map, what do you understand the word happiness to mean, or something like that. And the point of them is to pique their interest, establish a baseline, what those children already know, and see where you're starting from, and have a look across the classroom and see the diversity of where you're starting from with those students. And we can use all manner of different things as these starter to assess this baseline. I particularly like the things that I've sort of the things that I've popped on the screen there. So, for example, the agree-disagree continuum. I really like that, because actually what we're monitoring then is what were the students' opinions at the beginning of this lesson or this topic, and let's revisit it. Have they changed their mind or their opinion, and why? Things like mind mapping what you know, teach an alien. So if an alien was to come down from outer space and you had to explain to them the concept of a friendship, what would you explain to an alien what a friendship is? You could pose an open question. And then particularly good for younger children and for SEND children, students, draw and write. So if writing is a barrier to them, so draw and write what you understand, you know, what would you associate with drugs? They might then draw, you know, what they perceive to be a drug dealer, or what do drugs look like, or where might you get those drugs from, and they could draw those instead of just writing, and that therefore makes it much more accessible for all students to have a go at that starter. And you're aiming, therefore, for 100% engagement right from the off in that. And then you can go back and then you can monitor what has that student learned in that lesson, have they? And you can see if they've changed their opinion, you can see if they've learned anything new. So this one is an example from year 3, healthy eating. You know, in the black pen is what they have, you know, they've added to start with. You know, what would be healthy eating? Well, they've got vegetables, fruit, no pizza, pasta's healthy, and they're not allowed to eat sweets. And then at the end of that lesson, they've gone through and they've added new things, for example, water and milk, and some other different vegetables, but they've also improved that by saying, well, we're going to do 5 vegetables a day. And they've changed their opinion in that some pizza is okay. And I like this little one because this particular child was really keen to sort of use their different coloured pens because they like the statement, eat the rainbow. And so from here, you can see at a glance that that child has learned some new things during that lesson and changed their opinion, you know, corrected some misconceptions. This is one that I actually did with my tutor group a few weeks ago. Explain to an alien what the word community means. And in the black pen, obviously, is what they understood the word community to be at the beginning of the lesson. And then this was probably, we revisited this probably after 2 lessons. And then to sort of have a look and, you know, how much, what had their opinion changed? How much could they add to that statement? How much deeper could they go into that question? And the one on the left is a pupil that really struggles with writing, and getting his ideas from his brain to his paper, but you can definitely see that actually, you know, he's managed to expand his idea that from just a group of people that have something in common to where you live or go to school, or a community could also encompass the world's population. Equally, on the right, a student who has gone much deeper into this topic, and everybody brings something to the community about how we treat each other with respect, and is using some higher level words, including things like diversity, inclusion, and belonging. So we can see that this student here has got a much deeper understanding of what a community is, and we could have used that at the beginning of a topic. And again, at the end of a topic, and we would expect possibly more detail, but within the course of a lesson, that's showing progression within that lesson. Another thing we did, I quite like this, was when we looked at the poem, and I asked the students to restructure this poem and rethink this poem and make it more modern day. Donna, help me out, please, because I've forgotten who wrote this poem. You're on mute, Donna.
This is what happens. You use technology and it goes, well, there you are, we're on mute. Yeah, so it's first they came for the Jews, that's what it's commonly kind of known as. Think about how we're speaking up for other people in our societies and what happens if we don't.
Yep. So we gave them this poem. It was part of the community's lesson, and I gave them a poem and asked them to really think about how we could make that. I had to explain to them what communist and trade unionist and things were. They weren't necessarily words that they were familiar with, but then they reworded it, and those that could rewrote the whole thing out. But again, this was a really accessible activity for a student that's not brilliant at writing, not comfortable with writing. Thank you, Leroy, Pastor. I can't pronounce that word. And I don't want to say it wrong, but that is in the chat, the person that wrote this. And so they then really had to think about actually who do we need to speak up for? And they and obviously then were able to rewrite that poem. And then here's an example of the continuum where they mark up. So obviously the pink triangle is with their opinion to start with, and then the blue circle is after that healthy relationships. I think it was 4 or 5 lessons I did this with my year 10s last year. How have they changed their opinion? And the important thing is not the fact that they have changed their opinion, but the 1, 2, 3, 4 at the bottom is an explanation as to why they've changed their opinion, or what is it that supports their idea. So it shows that they've really thought about their answer and really thought about whether they do agree or disagree with that statement, and it can help them move away from sometimes when they sit and do these statements, they look at what their mates have written and then they copy their mates in terms of their agreeing, disagreeing continuum to start with, but then they actually, when they have to really think about why they've changed their mind, that's a more personal thing for them to do as well. I think that's all my ideas really for starters and plenaries at the moment. I think Donna's going to take you through some more information on assessment.
Afternoon all, and I remember to unmute myself, so we're off to a great start. Thank you everyone for joining us. You know, when the sun is shining and you have lots to do, it's great to see so many people involved. So yes, so I am SLT here at SBB Academy. I've been in the school prior to its inception. I've been here an awful long time. My primary role is a teacher of English, although I oversee behaviour and achievement for year 10 and year 11. And in recent years, I have had personal development placed upon my role, which is quite a nebulous subject, and we're going to try and dig down into some particular facets of it, particularly in terms of assessment. So for me, really, session outcomes for today, it's really just to reflect on the RSHE guidance and requirements for assessment, and how that fits in with the structures within your own settings, to identify some different assessment processes. Rebecca's obviously mentioned a few already, but we'll go on to talk about those in general. And then as part of the discussion more widely, to consider how assessment can improve outcomes for pupils and not just in terms of academic performance. Next slide, please. So we're going to start, before looking at some specifics about formative assessment, really about the rationale behind assessment, because it is such a nebulous concept within the kind of parameters of PSHE that it can feel really quite daunting. And whilst I don't want to read every single point from this slide, and obviously everything was available to everyone after the session, it's really important that we do come from the background of understanding why learning in PSHE education should be assessed for lots of different reasons. I think for me, I've always fought with the idea that anything to do with PSHE is the woolly subject, because you don't have this necessarily tangible outcome at the end in terms of a GCSE grade. And because of that, it lends itself to open to quite some difficulties, because often what you'll find is that within your settings, almost every single teacher in some form is a teacher of PSHE, whether that is as a discrete subject area, whether that's as a personal tutor, whether that's as someone delivering enrichment. So it's really important that we get to some of the basics. But in essence, why should assessment exist for PSHE? Well, it's important for students to help teachers to reflect on their learning, especially when their learning relates directly to their own identity, because we're now not talking about students in terms of English, maths and science. We're now talking about them as individual people with qualities and skills and attributes that we want to really develop over the time. And I think one of the key strands in any kind of Ofsted kind of visit will be in terms of personal development, which obviously PSHE falls into. And it's important to understand that probably now more than ever, our students need to feel that they are valued and their development is valued as a person, not just in terms of a P8 score. And I think schools that only focus on the academic assessment, I think, fall short of really what the students need. And I think if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that we do need to have more of an invested interest in our students as individual people, and understanding that their wider development is central to their successes, not just in terms of their time in school, but obviously outside of school as well. And it also increases their kind of motivation, improves their learning, their understanding about that their views matter. PSHE ultimately is not about us being able to have students able to understand what is the legal limit for blood alcohol content if you're driving a car, or at what kind of term, you know, abortion's illegal in the UK. It's more about them having a voice and being able to use that voice more widely to develop their perspectives on the world that they live in. Now, a lot of the information comes from multiple sources. My own experiences within school, than PSHE, but also other platforms that I think really have a great focus on PSHE development and assessment. So if your centres aren't linked to people like the National College for CPD, I'll be speaking to someone in your centre about that. The PSHE Association, again, if your schools don't have memberships to that, that'd be something that I'd be strongly recommending that every centre has access to. And obviously some of the information shared with you today is from the EEF, the Education Endowment, kind of to focus on really where you can have the most impact for the least financial outlay, because obviously times are hard for lots of schools and staff don't want to, and the finance teams within schools don't want to necessarily prioritise money where they can save money. So this is really why we're looking at assessment today. Next slide, please. Now, obviously, what we do for our students in our schools should never, ever be about Ofsted. And I think if that's the only thing your schools are focused on, I think they have their priorities wrong. And I speak from someone who's been in RI school for multiple years. Our most recent Ofsted was in November 2021, and for a school which is a significantly deprived area, securing that good judgment was absolutely vital for us, but also important knowing that in terms of personal development, we were a whisker away from outstanding, and the lead HMI made a phone call to the head office at Ofsted. There's a special golden phone apparently somewhere, so we were told we were impressive, but yeah, other than that we didn't quite make it. But ultimately inspectors will look at personal development, and they'll look at PSHE and the assessment of PSHE in a very different way than they would ordinarily with your general curriculum subjects, because what they will look at is things like the range and quality of take-up of extracurricular activities offered in the school. They will look at how the curriculum is taught across which year groups and what you've decided to focus on in each year group. It will focus on things like British values and students' understanding of that, and how that's delivered through personal tutor programme for your assemblies. And what they'll really look at is being able to triangulate everything that you have told them that will happen. It won't just be a folder of here's some evidence, let's take a look at our curriculum map. It will be, in terms of PSHE, active discussions with personal development leads. It will be discussions with students about what they learn in PSHE lessons, what they learn in assemblies, and why that's important to their own development. And the focus obviously is then linking into things like protected characteristics, and how students know that there are 9 protected characteristics and why they're important. And it's about them being able to articulate that. So for us, our key focus was ensuring that in terms of assessment, we were looking at Oracy and driving Oracy as a way to look at students' levels of understanding, rather than having a series of documented ideas in a book that a teacher could put a tick to. That did not serve a kind of purpose for us. Next slide, please. So Ofsted themselves recognise this, that you often won't be able to assess the impact of your personal development provision while pupils are at school. For that reason, inspectors won't try to measure the impact of your provision on individual pupils. And that's where assessment becomes really quite difficult, because we're so conditioned to looking at outcomes, and we're so conditioned to looking at assessment in terms of tangible numerical grades, that when that isn't there, it leads us short. And you know, PSHE Association are the first ones to admit that. From the DFE, the steer on assessment for PSHE isn't as rigorous as it could be, and often schools are left to create their own pathways and what assessment looks like. And if you're in a centre that pays lip service to personal development, because unfortunately we do sometimes get that, then you will not have that same centre directed rigour that's really needed in order to ensure that all students feel valued and listened to, and that their voice matters. Thank you. So this is taken directly from the PSHE Association in 2020, and I will read it out because it's important that we start to kind of pick some of the language within this. And it's important for pupils to have the opportunities to reflect on their learning, especially when their learning relates directly to the individual's identity and their personal qualities attitudes, skills, attributes, achievements, and influences. It is important for teachers to feel confident that the learning has taken place, to be able to demonstrate progress and to identify future learning needs. Assessment increases people's motivation, improve learning as they increase their levels of awareness of their own progress, and their development illustrates the value for their learning. And what that in essence boils down to the fact that is often schools will, in terms of PSHE, not set students based on ability. We have a school system that has parallel banding for our groups. For our PSHE lessons, our core lessons as we call them, they aren't graded or banded based on ability. So I have to rely on staff through the CPD that we offer to be able to differentiate from a basic program that's put together by my directors of year for all teachers of PSHE. Next slide, please. And it becomes particularly difficult because what we're not just looking at is knowledge and understanding. So if I'm looking at English and I want to know about Macbeth, I can quantify the level of understanding by being able to do some low stakes quizzes on the plot of Macbeth. I'm able to look at a character diary entry. I'm able to look at a quotation filling exercise or a close exercise. So it's not just about understanding and knowledge when it comes to relationships or puberty or online safety or mental well-being or you know, anything else that falls in the parameters of PSHE, which is absolutely extensive. But it is our ability to assess pupils' own skill set. So whether they're able to show the skill of empathy or compassion, that is a skill. It's not just an attribute. They have to be able to learn how to do that. They have to be able to give instructions to be able to feel confident in order to display those skills. And it is about assessing their attributes, assessing their honesty, assessing their generosity. And I don't just mean generosity in terms of what they're able to give in terms of pen or pencil, but the generosity of time, being able to listen to people properly and accept their point of view and develop from that point of view. And that's why when we talk about assessment in PSHE, it becomes so much more difficult, because how do you set up a test? And that's how we condition ourselves within, you know, the education framework. What test is there to prove honesty? What test is there to prove integrity? And invariably, the key way in order to assess anything in PSHE is done from the point of students' involvement with discussions in the classroom environment. And for us, that is absolutely paramount. Next slide, please. So Beck's already talked about this concept of kind of baseline assessment and assessment for learning, which is our formative assessment, and then the kind of summative assessment right at the end. And we are focusing primarily, obviously, today on that formative assessment and why it exists. Well, it exists to enable pupils to understand. Well, these slides, sorry, yes, you can have these. I'm sure that's what Chloe will sort out access to these slides afterwards. Beck is on mute, but not absolutely acknowledging that afterwards. What I've also said, just as an offset as well to Rebecca and Chloe, is that they're more than happy in the chat function to place my email directly. So if anyone wants to email me directly, I am more than happy to kind of field further questions or resources further down the line, because sometimes often people, even if been teaching a long time, can be left quite on their own when it comes to personal development, because sometimes not everyone has the answers. But assessment for learning obviously enables pupils to understand what they're expected to learn, how well they are doing, and what they need to do to improve. That is no different to any other subject. It encourages pupils to have that active participation in learning. I think that's where it differs for PSHE, because whilst as you know, as English teachers, as math teachers, as science teachers, we might want to encourage participation. Not often does that happen in the way we want. Whereas when we're dealing with subjects that matter to students because it's part and parcel of their identity, students are more likely to want to get involved. But at the same time, they can also be more resistant to getting involved, because it is about personal opinions in terms of their lives and what they think. So it's mindful to understand that. One of the things we have at the academy is a It's a kind of no shouting out kind of cold calling policy for asking questions. So we'll ask a question, we'll ask a student at the end, you know, give a student's name at the end of the question and expect them to respond with a no opt-out kind of option. That is different for PSHE and in terms of assessment, because obviously sometimes student responses can be quite personal. Their views on certain subjects can come from triggering places, and you want to be able to give students the framework and able to talk freely, but understand that sometimes their personal opinions don't want to be shared. So this is kind of the focus of looking at, is that how we can evidence that learning without it being some arduous, onerous task that involves absolute kind of responses in a textbook to questions, and it's about memory recall. Assessment in PSHE is far more than that. It's far more than that. Next slide, please. So how do we quantify progress? So Rebecca has kind of talked about some of these and some of the ideas that we use here. Rebecca's already mentioned as part of the starters and plenary section. But the kind of the baseline assessment and the endpoint activity, and by the way, what I mean by endpoint activity is not necessarily summative assessment. An endpoint can be part way through a piece of learning, but it's your job as the practitioner in the classroom to understand and to try and tease out responses from pupils and to direct the narrative within that classroom. So one of the best ways in which to do that is with questioning. Is having those open-ended questions where you are allowed students the freedom to respond in a way that they see fit to a question, regardless of the subject matter. Now, the endpoint to that might be to revisit those key questions at the start of the lesson. It might be to using a kind of higher order question matrix, so students are able to create their own questions in terms of the learning that has just happened. Discussions are obviously a significant way in order to assess students' levels of understanding. So you might want to revisit, as Rebecca showed you with those images, revisit from first thoughts and what people's preconceived ideas were on a particular subject to what that now looks like after the learning's happened. But you might want to take that one step further, and you might want to then include some sort of formal debate. You might want to incorporate kind of presentations that focus on the new me. And what I mean by the new me is this is what the old me knew, this is now what the new me understands. Rebecca talked about tell an alien. Because I'm obviously in a secondary environment, I talk it through in terms of tele year 4 students and trying to get them to simplify their levels of understanding. Rebecca used the, I think it was the year 3 healthy eating, brainstorming, kind of mind mapping activity. The idea that the first ideas are placed down in one colour and then they revisit and they add and they amend and they expand. And that's the key thing. It's not just about adding more in terms of what you now know. It's about developing and expanding from that to kind of quantify that level of understanding. It's also really helpful to look at things like role play. To get students to potentially script conversations. I come from a theatre background, so I get students to work using improvisation. So imagining discussions on given subjects, imagine kind of perceived scenarios that they might be in, but I might also ask them to use and create scripts. I might also get them to use forum theatre. I know that any drama specialists are in the room, but forum theatre is where you pause a piece of performance and step in to replace a character to look at a different possible outcome. So I'd often use this particularly in sessions that are focused on friendships or relationships. I might stage a scenario that has a negative friendship circle, and I might ask students to stop in and see where they can fix the problem. So they pause the action and then go in to replace a student and look at alternative ways. Again, it's another form of assessment. You are seeing what students are able to show in terms of their learning. Storyboards and cartoon scripts are still there in the same way as mind mapping, where you can use different colours or where you can create a kind of alternate world based on your new levels of understanding. And again, responding to scenarios and video clips. There is a wealth of resources out there. As I said, I've already kind of raised the PSHRE Association, but a wealth of resources out there that you can use that respond to student videos. So there are videos based on there for scenarios scenarios that you might not feel comfortable talking about yourself as a teacher, and ask students to respond to that. What would they do if they were in someone else's shoes? What are the outcomes if a student does X, Y, and Z? So you're getting them to think preemptively about outcomes and situations. It's particularly good for looking at things like county lines, and for drug awareness and gambling and pornography, which is quite a difficult subject. You know, when the statutory framework came in September 2020, and schools, obviously some schools didn't quite start September 2020 with COVID and lockdown, and kind of Ofsted and Department for Education understood that. We were on board a bit before then, so we were still able to run the sessions and the curriculum in the way that we wanted. But you imagine, I've got a maths teacher who's been teaching for 36 years, taking a PSHRE lesson on pornography in year 9, and there's a reason why we place it in year 9 and year 10. And there's a considerable level of CPD that needs to be done to that, and therefore it's about staff understanding the wealth of support outside of schools in order to help them create a curriculum that is fit for purpose, but also that will help support the assessment needs of the students in their schools. Next slide, please, Chloe. Thank you. But then there's also a kind of a wealth and a raft of other different things that you could use. Don't be afraid to get students to lead on presentations. That is another form of assessment. Again, it doesn't just have to be something written down. Get students to think about producing resources and materials to teach younger students. We're currently involved with a project with one of our feeder primaries on cyber safety. So our year 8s, as part of their curriculum, looking at that, working with year 4s, and they are going over to the school to present to the year 4s about what they've learned about cyber safety. That itself is evidence in about impact and assessment. Their learning of cyber safety has enabled them to create presentations that they will teach to someone else. That is the outcome for the students. That is how they are being assessed. You might want to get them to lead on discussions or in a learning activity. You might want them to produce a blog or a podcast. We try to use IT quite a lot in school rather than just presentations and PowerPoints. We get students to do that. You might want to have them create a self-reflection diary in terms of what they've learned. And again, don't be afraid and don't think that it doesn't feel like there's a lot there to prove their levels of learning. If you've taken them from one point at the start and you have some development, that is progress. That is progress. And again, we need to get away from this idea that unless we have so much written, and unless we're able to quantify this with an extended piece of writing, how can we assess progress? Obviously, that is not the position we're in, certainly for PSHE. Next slide, please. So Beck is kind of, and I'm just going to really quickly kind of focus through these. Beck's already used an example of some of these with a healthy eating, but this is a one in relation to drug abuse. And again, the same premise, that you have the initial baseline assessment activity in one particular colour. And then you have the revisit or the endpoint assessment, in which you will get a student to go back to their initial learning and get them to evidence what they now know. What you'll see, it's not just in a different colour, but you'll see there is far much more depth that shows that level of understanding. It shows that progress in terms of that particular subject. Next slide, please, Chloe. And again, the continued activities, the kind of how secure they are in believing or agreeing with one statement. And you'll see you have the symbols there that recognise at the start of the kind of unit what their viewpoint was and where that changes. And as Beck's referenced, you have those 4 points to explain why they now think differently on the subject. What has their learning shown them, and how has that impacted their views on the subject that they're dealing with? Next slide, please. Again, this is linked with creative kind of education, but you might want to get them to do graffiti walls. Again, this can serve all students, not just those that are maybe SEND and don't like putting pen to paper. But again, thinking about the dangers, kind of dangerous society, so online and offline. Again, before the unit, what makes it? And again, this could be a word dump. You know, we don't have to get bogged down with it has to be in full sentences. It has to be, you know, yes, we obviously want to make sure that when, you know, as an English teacher, we want things to be grammatically correct and spelling's there, but it's about the quality of their learning. What do they know now? What do we want them to know? Why is that important? And how can that be evidenced at the end? So graffiti walls can be available. And again, I will make sure, guys, that for those that want me to email directly, you will have copies of these resources so you can edit them yourself as well. That's not a problem. Next slide, please, Chloe. In school, we use, and this is born on the fact that one of the AQA English questions ask students to respond to a statement and get them to think about how far they agree with it. So I've tried to use that kind of cross-curricular ideas. So we have a statement here. It's not what you look like that matters. It's what kind of person you are and how you feel about yourself. How far do you agree with a statement? And again, students can talk through in terms of their strong disagreement or they strongly agree and the reason why. For our previous Ofsted before November 2021, one of the things that we knew we had to focus on was developing the oracy of our young people. So what we created were discussion mats that students have in classrooms, but that are also in the booklets. And I'll talk about the booklets in a few moments. And what we will be really clear of is that the evidence of their kind of progress will be shown through discussions, but we would expect them to use these sentence stems, whether that was expressing an opinion in the first instance or building on the views of others. So that was really important that we used Oracy as a way to evidence progress with an assessment within PSHRE. We can skip this one, Chloe, that one's fine. You might also have to get the students to think about scenarios that they're in. So this one was about kind of tolerance and understanding of other people. So we gave this is 5 scenarios, and we get students to pick a scenario and give advice to that person on what they should do and how do you think the way they are treated makes them feel. So we're getting them with their discussions to think about the attributes like empathy as well, and you know, all the things that we want students to be mindful of in terms of their own personal development. Next slide, please, Chloe. I will make sure that you get, obviously you'll have this in the slides, but again in a separate PowerPoint format for those that want it. Again, thinking about this hierarchy of questions, getting students to start at the basic end of their kind of baseline assessments, sentences that show simple levels of understanding and what can they remember, all the way to creating questions and creating ideas about the topics they've looked at. So I know that in order to be, okay, so I have, or we have created, and it gets them to think about those higher order questions that will evidence their level of understanding. Next slide, please. This again is just the sentence stems to shape discussion, and again that way to evidence, you know, assessing students. Please do not be afraid that to understand that verbal responses are a form of assessment. Students being able to clarify what they mean is important form of assessment. It isn't just about what they write within their booklets or their books or whatever method is schools use in order to record their understanding. Next slide, please. So here at our academy, what we have is we use core booklets. But they really are a log for simply jotting down ideas. They're not anything formally assessed. Teachers aren't heavily giving over extended comments in the booklets. They are there as a mechanism for students to jot down their thoughts and ideas. And very, very clear at the front of the booklet, it will explain what the unit's about, and it'll be about how the booklet is to be used. If we move on to the next slide, Chloe. One more, please. You will see that we will start with a kind of pre-unit self-assessment. So we will start with the kind of current levels of understanding. So this obviously one is, I understand what is meant by self-esteem. I can identify a range of factors that both positively and negatively impact my sense of self-worth, and a whole series of statements, and students will rate themselves against that. Now, obviously staff will then use the discussions in the classroom to look at whether the student's own assessment of themselves is actually in line with what this teacher sees. Now, we're not talking about reporting particularly as part of this, but obviously schools need to consider you've put in all the pre-work before the curriculum map is in place. So you also need to think about reporting. We report really quite simply in terms of ATL. So we, in terms of assessment and reporting on that, we use our very simple 4-point system. So for a student to get a 1 within their core lessons or for a particular unit, it will say a student frequently makes a valuable contribution to core lessons. Now, that doesn't have to just be verbal contributions. That could be in terms of what's written in their booklets, okay? And be able to engage with challenging and sensitive topics with maturity, showing respect for the opinions of others. We kept it really simple. That is the criteria that we report to parents on for PSHE. Some schools decide to do it, what Chloe's going to show you now on the next slide. And they use this kind of stranded process and using ICANN statements in order to assess and report. So if this one is on health and well-being, you could have a series of statements which are working towards, working at, or working beyond. And you can assess students based on ICANN statements too. What you tend to find as schools move away from working on heavily kind of focused ICANN statements, because it becomes quite a laborious task for staff to kind of focus on, and it becomes more of a paper pushing exercise rather than really looking at students' kind of needs. But I think ultimately, before I close, because I'm aware that I've spoken for about 20 minutes or so now, is the key to remember is that whoever your personal development need within the school and whoever your PSHE lead in the school is that they have a really clear framework for what assessment looks like for your school. And that for any teacher delivering PSHE, you are supported through that process, from curriculum creation to delivery to assessment of the units that you deliver and reporting. If anyone needs any further guidance, above and beyond the slides that you have, and see people in the chat function placing email addresses, I will drop you all a kind of email this evening just so you have my direct contact, and then we can make sure that any specific questions that you want to ask at a later date, or any of the resources you might want to see an example of, whether that's a unit of work, a paper resource, whatever, I can make sure that you have access to all of those. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Donna. That was really, really interesting, and I can see lots of people in the chat getting very excited as well. So hi everyone, my name is Nicole Rodden, and I'm one of the co-founders of an organisation called Life Lessons, and we work with a number of schools up and down the country, supporting them to put young people at the heart of sex and relationships education, which is a lot of what we've spoken about today, is that people's feeling heard, feeling valued, and using this subject, this really special and wonderful subject, as a way for pupils to really work on, you know, what do they think about things, and how can we let that shine in PSHE. Thanks, Chloe. And so what